Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and the winner for the poll for today's video was about why Tim Martin supports Brexit, the owner of Wetherspoons. Now, don't forget you can suggest topics as well as vote for them on the polls in the community tab by clicking the channel name. Today's video is one such suggested topic on Tim Martin. Never would have come up with myself as such. But for those who don't know who it is, it's the owner of a chain of pubs called Wetherspoons. Actually, I mean, it's a while since I've been in one now, but they're quite nice pubs. I used to go into the one in Grimsby quite a bit, either with colleagues on a works night out, or just waiting for a train as it was right next to the station. Nice decor, it's my sort of pub in many ways. Some reasonable beers on offer. There's at least a different selection to the ones you'd find in normal pubs. But what about the owner? Now, he came particularly to the public eye as a result of Brexit. But he not only distinguishes himself as one of the very few business owners who's in favour of our exit, but he's been a very prominent campaigner in his own right. Now, a couple of months ago, I got this through my letterbox, the Wetherspoons free magazine. So, do these come out every now and then? It calls this the Winter 2018-19 edition. Do these come out every couple, twice a year or something, or 4 times a year with each season? No, it's the first time I've ever had this. This is a very Brexit-themed one. It came out round about the time that it looked like Parliament might be willing to steer the government away from a no-deal Brexit. This threw quite a lot of prominent Brexiteers into spasms, really, and they all suddenly went much heavier on the propaganda, maybe feeling at that point that they'd won and all of a sudden actually it's in danger. And that's the result of it. There's quite a lot of the Brexit propaganda in the pubs now. But this came through my letterbox. Can't even just not go into Wetherspoons. But in terms of what he wants, that is actually really tricky. And it's something I've puzzled over myself. Because unlike a lot of famous Brexiteers, Tim Martin doesn't actually gain from Brexit in a financial sense, at least not in an obvious financial sense. In fact, he loses. When the referendum result was announced, shares in his company dropped 18 million quid. He's also expressed admiration, just funnily enough, for both Churchill and Thatcher. And I always think to myself, whenever anyone does that, he says, yeah, but the former suggested the formation of the European community, and the latter urged its reformation into what is now the modern EU. But I don't think his admiration was for those two features. In fact, quite a lot of people forget that those two people even did those two things. But anyway, his pubs tend to be in town centre locations. Now, I can't swear that every single one is, but the ones I've seen have been. So the health of his business is not only tied to the concepts of pubs in general, but of the high street as well. Now, both of these have been hit quite badly. There's been a notable decline in both of them over my lifetime. So when I was growing up, for example, in the village where I lived, there were about a dozen pubs. You couldn't walk very far at all without coming across a pub. There are much fewer now. And in fact, where I live now, which is not even in the same town, it's not exactly the middle of nowhere. This is like suburbia. There's housing estates after housing estates. But there is not a single pub in walking distance, let alone staggering distance. Certainly not. I couldn't just walk to the pub. Wouldn't, be take forever. Now, as for the high street, nowadays it is very, very common to see empty premises boarded up, shops in the process of closing down, even on the high street, the main street. Very few are opening to replace them. Councils are trying to do all sorts of things to try and encourage it, try and make it easier, offer sort of flexible arrangements for businesses. Every now and then you get one popping up and it doesn't usually last very long at all. So recently, Wetherspoons had to announce a profit warning. This basically means that their profits, such as they are less than they'd even planned for. Now, Mr. Martin said this had nothing to do with Brexit. Now, to be fair, unlike with James Dyson saying the same thing about moving his operations to Singapore, with whom the EU have just ratified their trade deal, in the case of Wetherspoons, you could argue it might be true. But that being, because, you think to yourself, well, the high street is declining and, pubs in general are declining, which is true, but at the same time a profit warning means not just that your profits are getting lower, but they're lower than you thought they were going to be. And the other thing is, when you consider that he lost so much value on his business when Brexit was announced, to be having profits hit more than expected as you approach the exit day, you have to think maybe there's more to it than simply high street and pub industry decline to blame. So, if his business is suffering, and therefore you would think his wealth, from Brexit, does that mean he's just the selfless sort of guy who believes that Brexit will be at least good for the common man and woman in the street? Is he a man of the people and okay, you know, if his business is going to decline, all right, then, well, I've made enough money, I'm all right. Not really, no. Although he tries to project himself as an ordinary bloke who likes a pint in the pub and hates middle-class dinner parties, he actually opposes things that would actually help his customers. He was very much against the living wage. He's also called for more taxes on supermarket produce, which would, of course, hit an awful lot of the poorer people in the country. He argues for lower taxation in general and therefore less spending on public services and welfare, again hitting his would-be customers. All things, indeed, that a far-right Conservative Party donor would be expected to call for, which indeed is what he is. So no, despite how he likes to project himself, a bit like Nigel Farage trying to project the same image when he's an extremely wealthy capitalist himself, a man of the people he is certainly not. Now, in terms of motivation, it's worth bearing in mind at this point that not everyone who wants Brexit stands to gain. There are some who would gain from Brexit, and even a no-deal Brexit, of course, but there are also other types of supporters. The obvious other type of supporter is someone who simply doesn't appreciate what's involved. Some of whom have already seen what they've voted for, especially those working in the car manufacturing industry or the financial services industry. But there are those who have an ideological opposition to EU membership. Now, that might, for example, be globalists who don't like the idea of trading blocks. They just want free trade everywhere, a bit like Jeremy Corbyn, I suppose, except I don't really see how you're going to get that by moving out of the bloc. But, you know, that's one reason. Some people, of course, rail against immigration. That was a big thing that was that was a big button that the Brexiteers pushed. So they knew there was a lot of feeling about that. And it could be either because they're xenophobic or just because they genuinely think that somehow, you know, immigration removes jobs from the market for native Britons. There are people who have that view. But that doesn't apply to Tim Martin really either. Although he has sort of said, oh yeah, we should definitely be able to control our own immigration, he's also said that we absolutely need inward immigration and that we actually need more than we have. He himself employs thousands of immigrants in his own pubs, so I don't think we can really regard him as being anti-immigration. So in terms of ideology, he comes up with the usual diatribes, of course, about democracy, freedom and Brussels bureaucrats. Although I've never really understood that last one because not a single EU law is decided in Brussels. I don't know, maybe he's just playing on the ignorance of people who don't bother to research what the EU actually is. Or maybe he's just genuinely ignorant himself. But aside from that, I have to say that I've not really seen an interview with him where he actually states why he's opposed to the EU, or at least the UK's membership of it. And I'm not just saying I don't accept his arguments. There are any number of people whose arguments I don't accept, but I at least know where they're coming from. With him, I don't. So what I'd have to do is give it my best guess. And speculation is all this is, I'm afraid. So we'll have to go with it. First of all, he is a self-centred capitalist. His opposition to public spending and taxation demonstrate that. But his business mostly attracts the working classes and lower middle classes. It's a down-to-earth pub for down-to-earth people. It doesn't try to be pretentious. It doesn't try to be posh. Quite the reverse. But the poorer those sorts of people are, and they do become poorer because of the policies he supports, the less they have to spend in his pubs. So perhaps the master plan is to ensure that the UK leaves the EU to consolidate on pro-capitalistic policies. After all, the UK do elect Conservatives almost all the time. Tony Blair's government was an aberration. Labour have never really won more than one election at a time before. Conservatives, on the other hand, are used to a bit more permanence in their governments. But there's an interesting dynamic in the country now, and indeed there was leading up to the referendum, quite divided. Because although there are believed to be much fewer Brexit supporters amongst the population, there are still a great many. Let's not pretend that it's dwindled. And the atmosphere in those pubs now is actually quite xenophobic when you go into Wetherspoons. Even though I accept that he himself isn't, I've had to stop going into them. They're awash with anti-EU propaganda. He even stopped selling European wines and beers very recently. And perhaps it's all designed to appeal to a disenfranchised population that may see his pubs as their little echo chambers with a beer and a ploughman's salad on the side. The place to go to get away from the madness of pro-European sentiment. Somewhere where you're allowed to attack the EU, allowed to attack our closest neighbours, and actually people will agree with you. Maybe he thinks that there's a business opportunity in being one of the very few in the hospitality industry openly opposed to membership of the EU. He wasn't really that much of a public figure before the Brexit campaign. In fact, he described himself as being quite shy, one of the reasons he didn't pursue a career in law. So maybe his sudden emergence as a public figure was a calculated attempt to turn rabble-rousing into a business opportunity. His business, you could argue, suffers less in the event of no deal from huge import tariffs on goods from countries for which at the moment we don't. That being said, he's not completely immune. Like any pub that wants to even pretend to stay in business, it serves food. And the UK gets 50% of its food imported. So it would hit costs there as well. Of course, I suppose it should come as no surprise, he has urged the government to completely remove import tariffs, or at least have them set very low, something the government had actually been thinking of. I mean, that would come as no surprise. That would, of course, help his business, because although many UK producers will be wiped out if the government did that, he wouldn't. Because although he imports things that he needs for his business, he doesn't export, and he's not going to have, we're not going to have sort of Danish pubs suddenly floating in as well. So it's not quite the same for his business. He's not really what you'd call a producer in that sense. So that wouldn't really harm his business, you could argue, but at least but not directly. The problem again comes in any action that knackers the economy is going to hit the poorest in society hardest. And those are his customers. And they're going to have then less money to spend in a business like that. So I'm not really seeing it. And although you can almost imagine, well, maybe even though each of his customers doesn't have as much to spend, if he attracts more customers because he makes himself the beacon for Brexiteers, and this could work in his favour whether we stay in the EU in the end or not. He creates himself as that beacon, because this country is going to be divided for a generation at least after this. But it's not playing out like that. His business has lost value in its shares as a result of Brexit, and it's making even less profit than it's predicting as we get closer to it. So I don't really see the business plan, if it is a business plan, working. So maybe it is just an ideology. Maybe that is all it is. He has some opposition to the EU. He hasn't expressed what it actually is because, as he says himself, he's quite a private person, even though he goes out doing talks and lectures and things like that now. But of course, those are very much the same style as they're basically rants. You know, he just comes out with the same diatribes that Nigel Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson, David Davis do. They're not necessarily giving you an inkling into why he wants to. So we'll just have to leave that to speculation, I'm afraid. But I hope you found the video interesting anyway. If you did, don't forget to give the video a like, subscribe for further content, click the bell notification please as well. And until next time, I'll see you later.